So we are looking at solving these quadratic equations, and now we're going to be moving on to solving them if they are the entire function. So y equal, or ax squared plus bx plus c. So we're going to be looking at these is that if we have a bx value, that we have to find our numbers. Okay, so first thing we want to do is we want to try to factor it. So with this, let's try to factor this and see what we get. Okay, so hopefully you took a second to factor it and you would have found out that it would be an x plus 2, x plus 3. So we can rewrite that original function so that it's x plus 2, x plus 3 equals 0. So we write it as two separate entities and then multiply them together to get our number. Okay. Now, that is going to be very important and very helpful because of the next property that we have. So the zero product property states that any number multiplied by 0 is 0. So 4 times 0 is 0. So 4 times 0 is going to be 0. And same thing applies with that second one. So if either one of these two parentheses is equal to 0, the entire function is 0. And what was our goal in the previous slide? Our goal in the previous slide was to get them equal to 0. That's what we wanted. We wanted them to equal 0. So if we want either one of those to be equal to 0, all we're going to do is that we're going to find what numbers plugged in to each one of those get a 0. So what do we have to plug in here into the first equation to get 0? That would be a negative 2. What number do I plug in here to get 0? That would be negative 3. So those would be our two answers. Okay? So those would be our two answers and our two zeros that we're looking for. All right? Okay, so let's say we have this equation right here. So let's say we have this equation. The first thing we want to do here is that we want to factor it. So take a second, factor this function down into its two binomials. Okay, so when we factored it, again, you can use your diamond for this. Two numbers multiplied get you a negative 10, added together get you a negative 9, would put you at negative 10 and positive 1. So we have x minus 10, x plus 1 equals 0. And so now what we're going to do is we take each one of those and we set both of them equal to 0. So we have x minus 10 is equal to 0 and x plus 1 is equal to 0, and then we solve. Okay. So then we solve. So this one we would add 10 to both sides. This one we would subtract 1 to both sides, getting us our answers of x equals 10 and x equals negative 1. And those would be our solutions. So now, looking back at our graphs, so now if we were to graph this, these numbers, so negative 1, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, okay, oops. So these numbers, those points, would end up being our x-intercepts, which is what we were trying to find. Okay, so we know those points on it. Then we can find our vertex and we could graph it. And so that would be our numbers. Okay. Okay, so now what we can do with these is that we can take them and we can make them more and more complex. Okay, so this is one that you'd have to use your box and diamond for, or use some sort of group factoring to help you find this one. Okay, so if we were to factor this one, what we end up getting down to is we end up with 2x plus 5 and x plus 1, or something similar to it. And we'd take each one of those functions and we'd solve each one as we plug it equal to 0. So we'd have 2x plus 5 is equal to 0 and x plus 1 is equal to 0. And we'd go through and we would solve it. Okay, and then we'd solve and we'd get our two numbers. So again, it's factor, set those two binomials equal to 0, solve. And that's basically what you're doing to find these x's. So with this first one, 2x plus 5 equals 0, subtract 5, get you a negative 5 over 2. And then when we move that 1 over, we end up with a negative 1. So we've got our -1, and we've got -5/2. Okay, and that would be our numbers. Okay. Okay, so pause the video, take a second to find the zeros of each of the following. Okay, so the first one, when you factor it, two numbers multiplied get you 56, added together get you a -15, would be x minus 7. So if you factored this, you should have gotten x minus 7 and x minus 8. That would have been your factors. Okay, that would have been your factors. So once you have those factors, you set equal, both of them equal to 0, and solve, getting you a positive 7 and a positive 8. Now the second one, if you tried to factor it, you would see that you weren't able to factor it. Okay, so if you're unable to factor it by hand, then you cannot solve it at the moment by factoring. We will be able to, in a few sections, we will be able to solve all these equations. Okay, there is formulas to help you find all the equations for those. So for these, what you're going to do is that you're going to take the functions, try to factor them. Most, if not all, will be able to be factored, and then set them equal to 0 and solve for each. So you should get 2 answers for every single one, unless the number is the same for both of them. So you could end up with like x minus 4, then obviously you just have one answer of 4. Okay, so here's your problems, section 4. You're finding the zeros for each.